So we're finally at the end of the semester. This is the last lecture topic we're going to cover. And fittingly, it kind of rounds it out with a coverage of all kinds of cool things that we've gone over this semester, including, but not limited to, how to programmatically access ChatGPT. And so you'll see here, this time we're going to use the RSocket mechanisms to send messages around. And in this particular implementation, we're going to have a database of famous quotes from William Shakespeare that's formatted in a way where you have the title of the work followed by the quote. And of course, there's an ID that uniquely identifies each one of these things. It's one of the primary keys. And we use this database to get random quotes from William Shakespeare, and then we send them over to the server, back to the responder, and that talks to ChatGPT and gets sentiment analysis of said quotes. So this is super fun and really interesting, and you can get it here at my GitHub repository. So this example also shows how to use RSocket security and authentication. We're going to go through that very quickly because we've already covered that in previous lessons. And the thing that we haven't talked about in this context is using the reactive database to retrieve the Shakespeare quotes and also to use ChatGPT. So let's talk about this. So we're going to use the RSocket requester. I'm trying to be more precise in my terminology. I called that client before, but it's really a requester. And it's going to talk to the responder, which will then give it things back. The requester can connect to the responder. It can send various kinds of messages to get Shakespeare quotes, and then it can send those quotes to another module to go talk to ChatGPT to get sentiment analysis of those quotes. And the whole thing has to be authenticated, so it uses security mechanisms. The responder receives the request for connections, and it also gets the binary messages, and it authenticates everything before everything starts up. This is what we've talked about before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We have the Quotes Connect controller that gets it's the endpoint that receives the client connection requests, forwards them to the service where they're stored in a map and then authenticated. The controller takes the messages and forwards them to the service. The service then will go ahead and use the R2DBC reactive database in order to give back the quotes that are requested from the client. And then the third piece, which is yet another controller, takes requests and forwards them to the sentiment service. And the sentiment service goes ahead and uses ChatGPT to analyze the sentiment of Shakespeare quotes. And you can learn about how to program ChatGPT by reading this blog. And then I'll show you specifically the APIs that you can use later when we get into the details. Right now, all the controllers and services all run in a single microservice, but it would be easy to split them apart into separate microservices. I did it this way primarily so that everything could be tested by pushing one button and it would launch the responder automatically and make the request from the requester. So that was just for testing convenience, but you really wouldn't design a real system like this. Quick overview of the structure of things, because it's gotten more elaborate. So we've got the server part, or the responder part, which is organized into a bunch of packages. This is where all the fun stuff really resides. We've got the ChatGPT sentiment analyzer. We've got the Connect controller. We've got the quoter, which is what gets the requests for the Shakespeare quotes. And then I also have another module, which we're not going to talk about here, which is the one that handles, it uses the older Stanford NLP library in order to analyze sentiment. And it's much simpler than the ChatGPT one. All it does is it gives you back a string that says the sentiment of the quote was positive, the sentiment of the quote was negative, the sentiment of the quote was neutral, which is not very interesting. So the ChatGPT one is more fun. So we're not going to talk about the one that's the core NLP library from Stanford, but it's there just in case you want to see how it works. We've got a bunch of common stuff that's useful for the project, including security. We have a repository folder now that stores the R2DBC database that has all the Shakespeare quotes in it. And of course, I used ChatGPT to generate the Shakespeare quotes. I asked ChatGPT, please generate for me 100 famous quotes from Shakespeare. And I told it to put it into SQL format. So it automatically generated the data SQL file and the schema that the database is initialized with. So it was really fun putting that together, and I didn't have to go and read through my high school English books to find Shakespeare quotes. And then we have a resources folder. This stuff isn't really too exciting, just normal stuff. The test folder has the requester side classes, including the test itself, the proxies and beans. And basically, the main thing that we changed here was we now have a sentiment proxy, and the sentiment proxy is what talks to the ChatGPT module or responder controller in order to be able to get the analysis of the sentiment. We'll take a look at that when we get into this. And there's a random utils thing that generates random numbers because we want to get random quotes from Shakespeare. And that's basically it. So that's the overview of the app.